So Salim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Well, I'd like to start by thanking Stuart Cole and Arno Fontenaire for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here in person and to join you in this important meeting. What I want to do in the time I have is I want to just share with you some thoughts on the global situation on vaccinations and what is it going to take to vaccinate the world. And I want to touch on 5 things. I want to talk briefly about securing adequate doses. I'm going to talk about the need right now to start building the capacity to manufacture vaccines in poor countries, particularly in Africa, because we can't wait for the next pandemic to do that. We have to start now, even if it doesn't contribute to vaccines on COVID-19. I'll then talk about the challenges of moving from having doses in country to actually putting them as jabs in arms and the challenges involved in that. And then I'll touch on some of the issues relating to monitoring variants and ensuring vaccine efficacy and monitoring that, and end off with touching on implementing WHO's global vaccine strategy. So those are the 5 areas I'm going to cover. So I think we're all very familiar with this. We had, the amazing success that we have seen in the rapid development of vaccines. And when I was asked in July, when can we expect a vaccine? I said, well, it takes a few years. Well, I didn't realize that we would already be having the first results in November, on the 9th of November last year. And when you think about the number of countries that had to be involved in all of the trials and the development of the initial Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the US, Turkey, Germany, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, all had sites contributing to this original trial. And since then, we've got several new vaccines that have become available. And I think Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, summarized it well when he said, what we have is an amazing success in science, but we have an amazing failure in ethics. And I want to touch on that failure. I'm going to talk about this valuable and vital resource. How is it being distributed? And the x-axis on this is the timeline, is when vaccines became available in each of the different countries. I'm going to talk about the 5 ways in which it became available. So the countries that developed vaccines, and there are about 5 or 6 of them, China, Russia, US, UK, Germany, they developed vaccines, and so they had vaccines available first. Now, some of these countries even started vaccinating the military even before they had approved the vaccines, even before they had the results of the phase 3 trial. But these countries were the ones that had vaccines first, all the way back in December of last year. The next set of countries that were able to secure vaccines, and I'm just giving this in broad strokes, are those that secured advanced market commitments. These are rich countries that were able to buy up vaccines before they even knew that the vaccines would be successful. And so you had a situation, for example, a country like Canada bought 9 doses of vaccines for each of its citizens because they were just hedging their bets as to which of these might work. The next were those countries that secured vaccines because of political diplomacy, or what was referred to as vaccine diplomacy, for political advantage. And those were countries like UAE, Turkey, Egypt, Morocco, Chile. And they were securing vaccines, and there was a quid pro quo, and those were largely on the basis of seeking favor. And then we had the countries that were then buying vaccines in standard bilateral supply and demand methods, and finally COVAX. And COVAX delivered its first vaccines in Mali. When you think now about these 5 different methods by which countries were securing vaccines, it gives you some idea how disjointed it is, and put very simply, it is seriously broken. And how broken is it? I'm going to touch on that briefly. if we look at the situation that we've taken what is perhaps the most important weapon we have, there's no perhaps about it, I'll be categoric about it, our most powerful weapon against this pandemic. And it's a pandemic, which means it affects all of us. And what we've ended up with a situation where rich countries are able to benefit from it and poor countries not. We have a situation right now in Africa where vaccine coverage is less than 5%. And I mean, to just make matters worse, South Africa has a factory that does fill and finish for Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And South Africa purchased 31 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And we've been waiting to get those doses. Meantime, it turns out that the company in South Africa had actually bottled 32 million doses and sent it off to Europe. So here we have a situation where vaccines are being made in South Africa, well, they're being bottled in South Africa, but they're being sent to Europe. So we've got to fix the system, and there has to be a way in which we deal with it, because what we in fact have is a situation of shortages in the midst of glut. And while some countries have shortages, and here there are many examples and many news reports and analyses that have been done of the number of doses that are being wasted in various countries. And I've just used the example here of the US, where millions of doses in the US are expiring, and states are scrambling to use those doses before they expire. So just how broken is the vaccine distribution system? Well, it's hard to actually call it a system. You know, one would assume in a system that things fit together and work well together. Instead of being a global public health good, COVID-19 vaccines are simply a commodity that have to be bought and sold. And they're being used for political benefits in what is widely being euphemistically referred to as vaccine diplomacy. And all of that is creating inequity, which, coming from South Africa, just, you know, it gives you the impression and creates the notion of being nothing short of vaccine apartheid. And we all know that apartheid was declared a crime against humanity. In this analysis that was done by the economists, they worked out that there are, in fact, enough vaccines for all if rich ones share. But what's happening is that half of the world's supply had been secured by just 15% of the population. Now, it should be pointed out that this analysis was done before the notion of boosters came into being, and I'll touch on that briefly. But I want to make one other additional point, because it's not just that there's inequity between countries. There are also inequities within countries. And I've just used this example from New Zealand, which shows that Maoris and Pacific peoples have far lower vaccine coverage and vaccine access than the remaining New Zealanders. And so we're seeing this challenge that's occurring. And it's been in many other countries as well, where, for example, in the US, vaccine coverage rates in Blacks have been lower than in whites. And so we're seeing this inequity playing itself out in various ways. I want to touch on boosters because I think it's quite an important issue. And it's an issue that is going to impact very substantially. And the Director General of the WHO, Tedros, has already pointed this out, that the WHO is calling for a moratorium on boosters to enable at least 10% of the population of every country to be vaccinated, at least aim to get healthcare workers and the elderly vaccinated. And he says, I will not stay silent while companies and countries that control the global supply of vaccines think that the world's poor should be satisfied with leftovers. And it's a challenge to deal with this problem, because I can very well understand countries want to give boosters and want to keep vaccines in the event that they're going to need it. Now, I'm of the view, and I think Brigitte Ortan said it very eloquently in her talk, and I fully agree with her, that there's a very strong case to be made for vaccinating and giving booster doses to those who are immunocompromised. I've just taken one example of a paper published here that looked at some of the challenges of getting responses to 2 doses of vaccine in immunocompromised people. She showed how in kidney patients and so on, we're seeing pretty low levels of response, and 3rd doses and even 4th doses may be helpful. So that's I'll set that aside as something I fully support. And I think the evidence is also steadily growing that it would benefit the elderly in some settings. But is there a need to go beyond those 2 groups? And I think that the data we've been seeing has been slowly accumulating. And we've seen that vaccine antibodies diminish over time. Brigitte showed us that, and there have been many different estimates. One estimate is that it halves about once every 60 days, and other estimates at 106 days. But we've seen the decline, and as Brigitte pointed out, that's to be expected. And we know that the memory B cells in the lymph nodes can regenerate antibodies quite quickly. And if we are to maintain in the entire population of, say, country X, a situation where the population always has high levels of circulating antibodies, my concern is that, are we talking about regular boosters? I don't know what interval that might be, but any booster will have a short-term effect, and it will also start deteriorating in terms of the levels that will be available months later. And if you're thinking at about a half-life of 60 days, roughly by about 6 to 7 months, you're down by 1 log. You're 1 log reduction in antibodies that are available. Now, the data we saw from Israel, and I've just put it up here from the Goldberg paper that's in medRxiv, shows quite clearly, and I'm pretty compelling. I find it pretty compelling, even though it's data that's not a randomized trial. It's simply an analysis, a descriptive epidemiological study, shows that the earlier individuals who've been vaccinated in January and February have had lower efficacy, vaccine efficacy, than those who were vaccinated later. Now, you have to know that this is a biased analysis because the elderly were vaccinated first. And so there is that issue in the analysis. And it's important that we do try to prevent clinical infections, because you want to try and prevent breakthrough infections so that people stop losing faith in vaccines. You want to reduce viral spread. You want to ensure people still go to work. So there is a case to be made for reducing just normal symptomatic infection that's not severe. But when you think about the high priority and what we should be prioritizing, there I have an issue. And we saw the data that was presented from Israel in the diagram on the left-hand side, which showed that the case that was made by our colleagues from Israel, based on these data, was that there is diminishing immunity for severe disease. But if you look at the data, there were too few cases in the younger individuals, but in the elderly, what you see is that these are highly overlapping levels of infection rates. But the analysis actually you need to see is in their supplementary table and supplementary figure. And when you do that analysis, and I've graphed it for you here, you get some idea of what the difference is. We're talking about very small differences in vaccine efficacy between those who were vaccinated in January versus those who are vaccinated in March. And remember, there's an age difference between the two, which is somewhat catered for in the stratification. So when I look at this, I don't see compelling evidence that there is waning immunity that is impacting in a very significant way for severe disease. But can we do both? Boosters on the one hand and adequate doses for poor countries on the other. Why not just do both? Well, it's because you've already heard from Mel that there's a problem that the demand for doses and the supply are not matched. And doses are a zero-sum game. Every dose that goes to country X means that there's fewer doses to go to others. And we've already seen the situation where, Africa already has a current shortfall just for this year of 470 million doses. And that COVAX has had to cut its own vaccine delivery targets. And it's missing its 2021 vaccine target because it just simply does not have enough doses. But at the same time, what we're seeing is countries hoarding doses and stockpiling doses because they think they're going to need to give boosters. They think they're going to need doses instead of making it available. That Africa is being affected just like everyone else, just in the same way that pain and that trauma of people dying across the world in the US and France and every other country we've seen, the same pain still exists in Africa. I want to just quickly touch on the remaining of the 5 issues, which is to start developing that self-sufficiently. And Africa has already made that step. And you've already heard the WHO has created a technology hub in South Africa as a starting point. And the EU has dedicated significant funds to assist Africa, and the African Union under the African CDC has created PAVM, which is the Partnership for Vaccine Manufacturing in Africa. And there's already initiatives underway to develop the capacity to manufacture RNA vaccines. Whether that will be ready to contribute to COVID-19 remains an open question, because what's going to be important for this to succeed is that we've got to have access to the IP, and we've got to have tech transfer with the know-how in order to make these goods in Africa. So let me touch on the third issue, which is about ensuring that doses efficiently get transferred to jabs, because it's one thing to deliver doses in poor countries like Africa, but those are countries that don't have a significant public health infrastructure. Those, in many instances, are healthcare systems that are already in trouble, and they don't have the resilience to take on new challenges. And especially something like COVID-19 vaccines, which is a universal adult vaccination program, countries don't have an existing infrastructure to do. They don't do that for any other vaccines. And so there are many new things, new resources, new things that have to be put in place, including cold chains and the professionals needed to provide this support, the ability to actually, print the cards, make sure people have the cards, and to ensure that you're monitoring the side effects and so on. So it's a huge amount of infrastructure that has to be built with it. And of course, with all of that goes the vaccine hesitancy and the anti-vax. I have to tell you, social media ensures that no boundaries exist for anti-vaxxers. They exist all over the world. And while even in my own country, we very quickly vaccinated the innovators and the early adopters, because they were standing in queues ready for their vaccines even before it became available. We're now having to deal with the bigger challenge, which is, the early majority, where these are individuals who will take their vaccine when it's convenient. So we've got to go out and reach them, because then we've got to get to the hesitant. These are not people who are anti-vax, they're just hesitant. They're not sure, they're concerned about safety and so on. I mean, the anti-vaxxers, which I've shown as skeptics, as laggards in the red, we're not even going to bother with. So let me touch on the last 2 of the 5 points I wanted to make, and that's monitoring vaccine effectiveness. And I think we all, rejoiced on the 9th of November when we heard the results of the Pfizer vaccine, and it came, I think, as a DSMB statement that, it was greater than 90% effectiveness. And I just thought to myself, wow, we have an end game now. We just need to vaccinate the world and we can, deal with this problem. But it wasn't even about a month later that, we were grappling with the beta variant in South Africa. And I just thought to myself, well, there goes that idea, because the variants have now changed the game. And we've seen that. And I've just used here examples from India, Brazil, and South Africa, all of which dealt with quite significant first waves. But just look at what the variants have done in each of those countries. I mean, we saw in India the devastating Delta wave. We saw in Brazil what Gamma has done. And South Africa, we dealt initially with a Beta variant wave, and now we've just finished our Delta variant wave. And so it's going to become really important as variants have changed the COVID-19 endgame, that we're going to have to ensure that we're monitoring in Africa and in poor countries across the world. We're monitoring the emergence of new variants, especially variants of concern, and that we are ensuring when we get and identify these new variants, that we have the ability to identify whether they pose a risk or not to our vaccine programs. And let me end off with the fifth of my 5 points, is that central to all of this is to implement the WHO's global vaccine strategy, which has just announced, which is looking at the 3 targets that have been set and the principles of the strategy. I won't go into it in any great detail at this point. It's available on the WHO website. But this provides us with an overall strategy. It's not a detailed roadmap, but it gives you the elements of what's required to ensure that we vaccinate the world. So let me conclude by just sharing with all of you a key lesson that I have learned in doing HIV research for over 35 years. And look at that lesson and see what it has for us in COVID-19. And that's the importance of mutual interdependence. And I'll quote here from the UNAIDS document. The AIDS movement demonstrates that with a shared vision, shared responsibility, and through global solidarity and the leadership of people living with AIDS, affected communities, and individual actions, we can change the course of history. And we have through the Global Fund, UNITAID, PEPFAR, we have changed the course of history. What was a uniformly a death sentence is now a chronic manageable condition. And we try to do that with COVAX, not the most successfully because of the challenges that I've already touched on. So let me end off with translating this importance of mutual interdependence by quoting from Pope Francis. If you'll indulge me, I'll just read a quote from an editorial that he published in the New York Times. The pandemic has exposed the paradox that while we are more connected, we are also more divided. To come out of this crisis better, we have to recover the knowledge that as a people, we have a shared destination. The pandemic has reminded us that no one is saved alone. What ties us to one another is what we commonly call solidarity. Solidarity is more than acts of generosity, important as they are. It is the call to embrace the reality that we are all bound by the bonds of reciprocity. I am safe when you are safe. One country is safe when all countries are safe. And through that, on this solid foundation, we can build a better, different human future. Thank you very much.